let me just stop there for one sort of editorial comment, because a lot of people, if they picked up the newspapers or read online or listened to the radio or watched TV after the governor's budget speech, may have heard the governor say, and may have heard people report, that the governor is cutting spending $1.8 billion. And a lot of people ask me, why, I'm a Republican, he's a Democrat, why can't you guys just work together? Why can't you talk together? Why are you always, he says he's cutting spending, you say he's increasing spending, why can't you guys sort of just get along, right? And I think it's interesting to explain why he says what he says and why I say what I say. And I'll give you this example, which I use. I don't know if it's a good one, but I use it because I have 3 kids and they eat a lot, so I end up going to the supermarket a lot. And I now have 2 in high school. And if I was spending $100 a week at the grocery store, knowing that this year, and knowing that kids are growing and getting bigger and eating more, I might sit down on a worksheet looking at my expenses for the next year and say, you know what, I need to spend $125 a week because my kids are eating. But when I look at my revenue and I'm not getting a pay raise and I can't afford $125 a week, I'm going to say, you know what, I can't afford it. So maybe I decide, okay, I can afford $110. Now last year I spent $100 a week on groceries. I want to spend $125 next year on groceries, but I can't afford it, so I'm only spending $110. Am I increasing my spending?
Yes.
I think I am. Governor Malloy would argue that he cut spending $15. I think it's funny too, but that's what we do. And what he says is, I work off something called a current services budget, which is everything I wish we can spend in every program for the state of Connecticut in a perfect world. Instead of working what I work off of, which is a zero-based budget, which is how much money do we have coming into government, that's about how much money we have to spend, and where can we not spend. And I think if you spend more money in one year than you spent in the previous year, you've increased spending. So that's kind of part of the dialogue that goes on between Democrats and Republicans, which is frustrating for me and for Jason and for Whit, which means it's maddening for you all. But I think it's important to kind of describe why we use different terms. If we take a look at the next slide, another issue which is problematic for us in the governor's budget is that it violates the constitutional spending cap. Many of you may recall, after the income tax came into existence, the people of the state of Connecticut, over 80% of us, voted to amend our state constitution to implement a spending cap to try to put some controls on how much government could increase spending. By Governor Malloy's own admission, his budget is $465 million over the spending cap in the first year and $690 million over the spending cap in the second year, over $1 billion over the spending cap. One might ask, well, if the Constitution says you have to have a balanced budget, and the Constitution requires you to live within the spending cap, how can the governor propose that budget? And stand up before the state and say, my budget comes in under the spending cap. And the answer is, he creates a new definition of the spending cap. It's not legal, it's not in law, he wants the legislature to pass it. He's the only governor that I'm aware of who's actually said, I'm going to create a new definition of the spending cap and argue that that's the one I have to live under even before it becomes law. If you take a look at the next slide, here are some other points of interest and contention within his proposal. You'll see at the first point, he proposes to bond or borrow $750 million to cover operating expenses in the budget. That borrowing will cost all of us an additional $186 million in interest payments over the lifetime of that borrowing. He also proposes to extend existing borrowing and debt, in effect sort of refinancing it for an additional 2 years instead of paying it off now as we're supposed to. That additional refinancing will cost us an additional $31 million. So if you total up those two figures, you have in excess of, well, about $215 million that we're going to spend to borrow money because we're not willing to cut spending in the state budget. Take a look at the next slide. Here are some other, and if there's questions, we can go over each of these. But one of the things I wanted to point out, which is, I think, notable in any community across the state of Connecticut, but especially notable in places like Bristol, is the second point, where there's a $74.8 million raid on the Special Transportation Fund. Governor Malloy came in office and said, I'm not going to take money that was intended to go to the Transportation Fund and use it for other purposes. In his first 2 years, he took about $70 to $75 million out of the Transportation Fund to cover his operating budget, and he's proposed it again. When you hear people in the legislature talk about putting tolls back on our highways, they argue we don't have enough money to fix our roads and bridges, so we need tolls to get more money to fix our roads and bridges. My response is, you're taking $75 million last year, $75 million this year. That's $150 million that was supposed to go to fix roads and bridges, and you're using it for other things. You shouldn't be taking more money from us until you use the money that you're given. I would also suggest that spending money on projects like the busway and some other things is one of the reasons why they're looking for more money to fix roads and bridges. There are hundreds of bridges in the state of Connecticut that have been tested by the Department of Transportation that fail the test of safety. And we should be using the money that comes in for transportation to fix those bridges. If you take a look at the next slide, this is a slide that is not talked a lot about in the media. I consistently say, and will consistently say, that this is probably a more important and more dangerous fact for the state of Connecticut than any two-year budget we might have. This shows our long-term liabilities. Now, we're spending about $20 billion a year, and our long-term liabilities are $66 billion. We have one of the worst of any state in the country. We're about as bad as Illinois when it comes to our underfunding of our pension funds. That is money that has been earned by people, and they're going to get that money one day, and we don't have it for them. And what are we going to do? I would also tell you that that $66 billion is probably closer to $80 billion. When the state makes contributions annually into the pension fund, it assumes a rate of return of 8.25%. See, this thing knows. Nobody's getting 8.25% out there in the real world. And so by assuming a rate of return that is not realistic in these times, we do two things. One, it allows us to put less money in annually, and then that number grows by underfunding the money that's owed to state employees in their pension. The next slide talks about one of the more controversial proposals the governor's offered, and that is the elimination of the car tax. The elimination of the car tax will take $632.8 million statewide out of towns and cities, and we could certainly talk about that. What's interesting to note here is that one of the arguments against the car tax is unfair, and I think in many ways it is unfair. Another argument is you can relieve towns and cities of the administrative burden of collecting the car tax, which will save them some of their costs. The governor doesn't do that because he only eliminates cars under $20,000. So towns and cities still have to keep the process in place to go out and collect the car property tax for cars that are in excess of $20,000. The other interesting thing to note is that several years ago, Governor Rell had proposed eliminating the car tax. Ironically, maybe this won't surprise you, one of the chief critics was the mayor of Stamford, Connecticut, Malloy. What Governor Rell did, though, was give the towns money that they lost in the car tax, so that the town would not have to make up for that money by increasing property taxes on your house or your commercial building. Governor Malloy has chosen not to do that. We take a look at the next slide, and this is essentially what Senator Welch and Representative Betts are dealing with, and others who represent these towns. This is the money that comes out of the various towns from the loss of the vehicle tax. If you take a look at the next slide, actually, I think we got those reversed. Is this the vehicle tax one? Right. This is the other reduction in state aid that the governor gives. Sorry, I got thrown off because the Bristol number is $10.5 million. Bristol being short of this budget. And quite frankly, I don't know how Bristol's going to make that up, other than some really difficult decisions we're going to have to make. If we take a look at the last slide, this is a small compilation. We could have gone on for several pages, but different organizations, different agencies, different magazines from Fortune and others have looked at Connecticut. We've been rated as the worst state to retire because we do something which I think is outrageous in taxing the pensions, taxing people on fixed incomes. We're traditionally ranked, for example, 45th in economic competitiveness, 45th in the best or worst places to do business. This is why we continue to see people and businesses and jobs in manufacturing specifically leave our state. The last page is how you can get in touch with the three of us. I know you know how to get in touch with these two guys because they do a great job on you. And I don't know, Jason, if you want to say anything, or Whit, before we take questions. But
I just wanted to thank you, John. But the main thing, as you know, and Jason and I have been doing this, is really to get an understanding of how much you know, how much you understand, and what your primary concerns are. We've yet to address the budget, which is unfortunate because this is really probably the #1 issue that's going to affect everybody in this room. But we're going to be doing it fairly shortly. So there is no such thing as a stupid question, and it's extremely important that you understand that what is going to be done here is going to have a multi-year impact. This is a very pivotal year for this budget. So if anybody has questions, this is now the time to do it before we really get into serious negotiations. And a second last, thanks. Before we get into negotiations to try and address the governor's budget. Jason, did you want to say anything?
I'm trying to get some air in the room, guys. How are you?
No, I don't have anything to add, but just thank you for coming. I hope you found this information to be helpful, and hopefully we can share some.
And I think this presentation is up on our respective websites as well. So you can log on to any of our websites, download this presentation. In Enfield a week or so ago, actually they came up with suggestions of slides we could add, which we're working on. So if you have suggestions on facts and figures that we could look at, we're willing to do that as well. So are we gonna go around the microphone, or people just stand up, right?
Or you can raise your hand.